In this video, we're going to be talking about lists. So I'm going to show you guys a really simple, straightforward way to render a list and talk about the things that you have to keep in mind when rendering out lists. Then I'm going to show you guys some fancy syntax that we can take advantage of that makes rendering lists a whole lot easier. But rendering a list is something that you got to do a lot in a web application. Everything from chat messages to user lists to list of cards in a card game, whatever. You will very often find yourself needing to render a list of elements. So how do you do that? Well, the easiest way, and this isn't actually entirely correct yet. We'll talk about that once I show you guys the basic concept. I'm going to say const items equals array, and I'm going to say for let to-do of to-dos. I'm going to say items.push, and I'm going to push on a JSX element. I'm going to say push li, and I'm going to say to-do.text. Then inside of this, I'm going to just literally print out that array. And React will know what to do with it. Now I am going to get an error, and that's fine. We'll talk about why in a second. But now we have a list of to-dos being... there we go. We have a list of to-dos being rendered out. And every time I change that, the list changes. So that's fantastic. But before we go into the error that we're going to get, let's go ahead and plop this into Babel Online. Again, I'm stressing this because JSX really isn't that scary. It put me off quite a bit, put me through a loop quite a bit when I was learning React, trying to understand the relationship between JSX and the instantiated components. It's important to understand that JSX does not instantiate components. It creates a representation of components that are then instantiated by React and managed by React. But as you can see, when we transpile this, we just say items.push react create element. Then when we render it out to the UL, we simply pass in items as an array as the children that are going to be rendered. And that's how it works. Very straightforward. Now let's talk about that error. The error that I'm going to get is going to say something about a key. It's going to say, warning, each child in array or iterator should have a unique key prop. Check the render method of the to-do list. Super fancy that it even tells you which component is failing. Oh, it even gives you this hierarchy. I think that's new in their error reporting. I know that they've been working on their error reporting for a little bit, but it'll tell you exactly where it is, basically. And basically what's going on is React doesn't know how to uniquely distinguish any of these LIs. It doesn't know the difference between this LI and that LI. So when one of these guys gets updated, it doesn't know which one to update. All it can do is repurpose the node or delete the node and create a new node or whatever. React, anytime you have an array, all of the elements inside of that array, anytime you render an array of Shadow DOM elements, all the elements inside of that array must have a unique key property. When I say key property, I literally mean a property called key. So that's another thing you should never make a custom property out of. Never make a custom property out of children. Never make a custom property out of key. So how do we provide a key? Well, it's simple. We just add the key property. But it has to be unique between each element. See, if I just did key equals hey, or a misspelling of hey, which I don't know how I managed to misspell that, we will get an error. And it will actually completely stop even rendering. Because you must have unique keys for each one of the elements in an array. I'm really trying to drive that point home. But fortunately we do. Each of these to-dos has an ID. So we can simply pass in, using the curly syntax, todo.id, and now React is happy. So now you see each individual LI has its own key. So I think that's fantastic. And that's basically how you would make lists in React. But this isn't quite the nicest sort of way to do it. Sometimes I will do it like this. I will create my own array and kind of make a for loop if my child components are so big or have a lot of JSX in them. Or I would create another component, like a to-do component, for example, and further abstract it away. But generally what I do is instead of doing it like this, instead of creating this array like this, delete that. I'm instead going to do todos.map. Todo goes into li todo.text and key equals todo.id. So now we're using the map function of the array of the todos array. And so if you're not familiar with the map function, it's a normal function on all arrays in JavaScript. It takes in a transformation and it returns a new array with each of the items in this original array being transformed. And as you can see, the syntax might look a little funky, but you will get used to it. And it is something you're going to see a lot in React applications, these sort of inline maps. And that's how you would go about doing this, or rendering out a list. As you can see, it still works, and we're not getting any warnings. So you'll also notice I'm not using, I can even put that in the same line. I'm not using parentheses. There's no need to use parentheses here like we do in this return, because JavaScript knows that in this context, it's not going to insert an arbitrary semicolon right there because that would be invalid JavaScript. So we do not need to wrap that in parentheses. Although technically it already is wrapped in parentheses because of the function, the method call, but whatever. But anyway, that's lists. I'm going to do one more thing here. I'm actually going to separate this out a little bit because we have a little bit more stuff to do inside of this to do. I want to have a strike through for each one of the items that is completed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a ternary operator. I'm going to say todo.isCompleted. Then I'm going to enter a new line, do question mark, do del for deleted, todo.text, then remove the del, and then otherwise simply todo.text. So now our completed to-dos will have a line through it. And it's important to understand that when doing these expressions, again, we can pop over into Babel to kind of figure out what's going on here. You have to understand that you can't use, inside of these expressions, you can't use if statements or loops or any control structure at all, because when it gets compiled, it gets compiled into an expression. So we have to take advantage of things like the map method or the ternary operator in order to keep our code concise. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to it, but I guarantee you by looking at this code a little bit, you will start to get used to it. If things start getting too complex, though, we could always abstract this into its own function, for example. Or we could abstract this into its own function, or whatever. We always have control over how verbose or how concise that we want to be. And in simple scenarios like this, in this case of the map, or in this case of the ternary, I will use expressions. I will use maps and ternaries, or filters, or whatever. But in more complicated scenarios, I might either break it out into its own component, or break it out into its own stateless component, or just create a vanilla function that returns a JSX element. Ultimately, it's up to you and what you're comfortable with as far as code readability, but I find this to be fairly readable and very concise. Maybe it just took me time to get used to it too, I don't know. But with that, we will see you guys next video.